In this discussion, we are concerned with the impact of the Swadeshi movement both in the long term and during the time when the movement had achieved a certain degree of militancy and spread effect. We have already seen in an earlier discussion that Swadeshi had different kinds of meanings. You have certain cultural meanings, and these cultural meanings blended with a certain kind of assertive nationalist politics. In the particular context of the Bengal partition of 1905, the Swadeshi spirit began to be articulated through the idea of boycott. The boycott was certainly a new kind of political language that the extremists were using, and the moderates were also unable to completely ignore the deep impact that the idea of boycott was making on the public mind.
Sir, how far did the concept of boycott feed into the political militancy?
That is the question that I was actually trying to draw your attention. That boycott, as it came to be interpreted by the rival groups of politicians in the Congress, or one group would actually look upon boycott as a very limited method. Boycott should remain, as they say, suggested, limited to boycott of British goods. So it links up with what was known as constructive Swadeshi or self-strengthening Swadeshi. Self-strengthening Swadeshi was the attempt to create local industries, the kind of industrial Swadeshi that became quite popular among the political public at that time. So this was one kind of boycott which dovetailed with the idea of Atma Shakti, put a good deal of emphasis on local industrialization, including the revival of handicrafts. The other dimension of boycott actually concerns a more comprehensive rejection of imperialism, not merely the commodities which were imported to India, but a more comprehensive rejection which will allow people to avoid any relationship with the imperial government. So the boycott would eventually, according to the extremist version, the kind of interpretation that was given to this idea by a man like Aurobindo Ghosh, that boycott was the first step towards passive resistance. By rejecting British institutions, you are actually creating your own indigenous systems or indigenous institutions to make people less dependent on the imperial state. So with that objective, many of these extremist outfits, some of these samitis in certain parts of rural Bengal had set up arbitration boards in which local disputes began to be settled. Swadesh Bandhav Samiti at Bakharganj, where the leadership came from a man like Ashwini Kumar Datta with some amount of influence among the rural folks. There were cases of frequent arbitration of disputes by the local arbitration boards managed by the nationalists. Now that was the first step towards what Aurobindo visualized, not just mere passive resistance, but more active resistance, by setting up examples of heroism, by resorting to individual violence if necessary. These individual acts of violence were expected to set examples for the people to rise up in an open rebellion against the imperial state. So boycott, with this extended meaning, visualized the transition to a situation where an armed uprising was visualized in India against imperialism. So you can see the clear differences in the way the boycott resolution was interpreted. Much of the success of the boycott, whether in that limited sense or in that enlarged sense, depended on how you mobilize the people. I mean, depended on the extent to which these Swadeshi leaders had been able to create a mass movement on the ground, because only through the creation of a mass following that the possibility of a mass uprising against imperialism could be realized. The Samiti movement became an important catalyst to the kind of politics that the extremist and later on the protagonist of a more militant kind of Swadeshi espoused. The Samitis, as you know, are of different kinds. Some of these Samitis were devoted to social service activities, inspired to some extent by Vivekananda's ideals in what was stated in Karma Yogin. I mean, social service as a part of your responsibility towards the community. Some of these Samitis were spreading the message of self-strengthening or Atma Shakti, devoted to rural reconstruction program. A few were devoted to physical culture movement, and once again the inspiration came from that ideological baggage of extremism, that in order to be able to contain imperialism, it was important for the Indians to acquire enough physical strength to be able to resist imperial oppression. Secondly, this was their answer to the way imperialism consigned the Indian people, especially the Bengalis, to a position of inferiority because of their deficient martial qualities. So it was important for the practitioners of Swadeshi, the adherents of this militant nationalism, to establish before the world that they were also capable, because of their martial or physical power, to contain imperialism.
Sir, how did this physical culture movement eventually become a major base of the revolutionary movement? And generally, what were the limitations of the Samiti movements?
You have then two questions, but these two are related. In the first place, these physical culture movements, along with some of the Samitis which flourished in eastern Bengal mainly, became the recruiting grounds for what is called the revolutionary movement, which focused or which emphasized as a stage in the progress towards armed uprising acts of individual terror which would set examples before the public, examples of great heroism, examples of self-sacrifice. So many of these Samitis, which initially were very open organizations, became attracted to revolutionary terrorism, became secret societies. Once the revolutionary terrorist method of agitation began to appeal to them. And this individual violence, however much these were intended to set examples, has something to do with the failure of the Samitis generally to create a mass following in the rural areas. Except for Swadesh Bandhav Samiti at Bakarganj, which was led by Ashwini Kumar Datta, about whom I was speaking a little while ago, most of these Samitis were dominated by young men from the genteel families, rural gentry, so to say, people who had a certain interest in rental income. We know that the Bengali bhadralok, who in fact provided the main social base of the Swadeshi movement, usually the lower echelons of the bhadralok community, the lesser bhadralok as they have been often described, people who didn't have enough income from rent, they were not large landowners, small gentry with a modicum of earning from rental income. So peasant mobilization, on the other hand, required mobilization of the peasantry around the rent question. Because in a province like Bengal, the rental demand on the peasantry kept on increasing. The gentry community became more and more differentiated. Some were earning more, some were earning less. You have a few zamindars with a huge earning, but the sub-infeudated structure of the gentry community created a situation where you have the phenomenon of what Professor Amalesh Tripathi has described as the falling gentry. People whose income from rent was declining, particularly after 1880s, when there was a measure of peasant protection introduced by the government after the Tenancy Act of 1885. So, mobilizing the peasants in the rural areas on the basis of the class demands was basically a threat to the existence of the gentry as a group, who had a falling income from land and who had a modicum of earning from professions. So these samitis, dominated as they were by members of the gentlefolk, young men from such genteel families, these samitis were not likely to adopt a militant peasant program, using the class demands of the peasantry for purposes of a mass mobilization. Except for Tilak, we don't find any of these extremist leaders participating in a kind of extensive peasant mobilization on the basis of their class demands. But Tilak had an advantage. He became involved in a no revenue campaign in 1895, where the main target was the state, the colonial state, which has raised the revenue. So this is the problem which comes over and over again in nationalist mobilization of the peasantry. Wherever the movement was directed against the colonial revenue policy, which increased revenue demand, it was easier for them to organize the peasantry than in the regions where peasant mobilization required a certain degree of mobilization against the local landowning classes. So if you are actually looking at the basic limitation of the Samiti movement, you see how the Samitis began to function as secret societies after the collapse of the main Swadeshi movement in 1908-1909. These revolutionary associations which had grown out of these Samitis, if you look at the history of how these associations began to flourish from 1908 onwards, you see that a few groups existed certainly in Western Bengal, but most of them were in Eastern Bengal. And Dhaka Anushilan Samiti was an offshoot of the Anushilan Samiti of Calcutta. Pulin Bihari Das was the leading man with combining Hindu ritual vows with a certain kind of spirit of self-sacrifice which they demanded from the freedom fighters, that worshipping motherland was tantamount to worshipping Shakti, and as the mother goddess demanded sacrifice from her devotees, the motherland also similarly demanded sacrifice from the freedom fighters. And so the Hindu ritual vows were introduced into some of the initiation ceremonies. You have on the other side the Maniktola group, Anushilan Samiti, in its inception, Aurobindo and his brother, Barin Ghosh, Hemchandra Kanungo, who was an expert in bomb making. But as you know, that the Maniktola group was exploded after that abortive attempt by Khudiram Bose on Kingsford, the notorious chief presidency magistrate of Calcutta, in the Muzaffarpur railway station. Accidentally, the members of the Kennedy family were killed. One would, however, actually try to analyze or try to explain the growth of this kind of individual violence against symbols, against particularly notorious officials, as a result of a certain failure on the part of the Samiti movement in the countryside to develop a kind of a mass organization capable of preparing the people for an armed revolt. These limitations notwithstanding, we admit that the Swadeshi movement was the catalyst to the gradual spread effect of the Swadeshi ideal in the rural areas or in the small towns. Despite these limitations, one, however, come across a major political innovation in the Swadeshi age. One has to admit that this was one of the earliest attempts by the nationalists to organize mass movement. In the absence of their ability to organize peasant mobilization, they naturally relied on a certain kind of Hindu political language, Hindu imagery, in order to reach out to the predominantly Hindu population. But at the same time, we come across attempts by some of the Swadeshi leaders like Ashwini Kumar Banerjee or Prabhat Kushum Rai Chaudhary in Calcutta to set up trade unions. Between 1905 and 1908, there were several instances of strikes in the jute mill. In Jamalpur railway workshop, a strike was organized. For the first time, we see the establishment of the printers union after a prolonged strike in the government printing presses. We see the establishment of the Railwaymen's Union also at around this time, around 1907, 1908, when some of the striking railway workers formed the Railwaymen's Union. So, in many spheres on the labor front, you see the first intimation of an organized trade union movement undertaken by the Swadeshi leaders.
Sir, was this impact of the Swadeshi only in Bengal or in other provinces also?
Yes, of course, you see the Tilakites involved in labor mobilization in Bombay. You have some extremist political groups involved in the famous Tuticorin strike at Tirunelveli district in the south. But labor mobilization is only just one aspect of the Swadeshi upsurge. It's an indication of how mass politics was actually emerging in India within limitations. Apart from labor mobilization, if you look at the situation in the Punjab, the militant nationalism had already made an impact, but one must admit that the kind of militancy that you come across in Bengal was never there in the Punjab, except around 1907-8, when, because of the kind of racial arrogance that was articulated through civil and military gazette, an official journal, there was an uproar. The Punjabi, a local newspaper, wrote articles in protest against this kind of racism shown by the civil and military gazette. The editor of the Punjabi was prosecuted for writing this kind of an essay, and instantly it created for some days at Lahore a very tense situation. And you have certain groups among the Punjab extremists who are not really content merely with constructive program. You have the personality of a man called Ajit Singh, the man who was incidentally the uncle of Bhagat Singh, one of the great revolutionaries of the later phase of revolutionary movement. So Ajit Singh group eventually became linked with some of the secret society activities planning a kind of armed revolution. In Varanasi, you have the group from which came a revolutionary of a later time, Sachindranath Sannal. So in each of the North Indian towns where Swadeshi ideology or extremist beliefs actually did not have much of an impact, but you have the Bengali immigrants who would create their Swadeshi outfits, and some of these Swadeshi outfits became eventually the nucleus of secret society movements at a later stage. If you come to South India, the impact that Bipin Chandra Pal made during his tour of Madras presidency at Rajamundry. Further south, we are talking about the labor movement in Tirunelveli. The entire problem was triggered by the attempt by a local British steam navigation company to destroy an Indian enterprise. And those tensions eventually culminated in the labor strike in the navigation sector. But at the same time, we come across strikes in a cotton mill as well. You have similar labor mobilization by the Tilakites in Bombay. Certainly, Tilak would not prefer strikes in mills owned by indigenous enterprises, because that would conflict with their emphasis on how Swadeshi enterprises should produce commodities locally for people to purchase as alternatives to British products. But at the same time, the militancy of the working class was revealed when there was a massive upsurge by Bombay workers against Tilak's arrest in July 1908. So it was not really restricted within the boundaries of Bengal, but you don't exactly find the repetition of the kind of militancy that you come across in Bengal. But if you look at the translation of the Swadeshi spirit into concrete political terms, you see it more remarkably in Bengal. And that has been very adequately worked out by a classic work on the subject by Professor Sumit Sarkar called Swadeshi Movement in Bengal, in which he has shown the different trends of the movement was the revolutionary movement, and the impact of which continued to be felt even after the collapse of the Swadeshi movement. But one has to talk about the Congress. The Congress became divided. Initially, there was certain amount of agreement about the boycott. But in Bengal, the moderates could not ignore the kind of radical interpretation that was being given to boycott by the militant nationalists. The Bengali sentiment had been heard by Curzon's decision to partition the province. They were unable to remain indifferent to these radical ideas. So, at the insistence of the Bengal extremists, the moderates in the Congress had to accept the radical interpretation of the boycott, which was to extend its implications from the boycott of British goods to a more comprehensive boycott of imperialism.
So, we all know that the Congress split in 1907 in the Surat session. So, I would like to know what were the issues which brought about the split in the Congress.
Yeah, that is the point that I was actually trying to make. Basically, it is related to the two different kinds of interpretations of the boycott. I have already indicated a little while ago that boycott as an idea was given an extended meaning by the extremists, which the moderates in Bengal were unable to ignore, partly because of their local equations. Bengal extremists would insist on the adoption by the Congress of a more comprehensive boycott resolution, which they did. Eventually, in the Calcutta session in 1906, where the boycott resolution was passed, but the moderate leadership from Bombay reluctantly agreed to these demands by the more radically inclined congressmen in the Calcutta session of the Congress. They were looking for an opportunity to give it a restricted meaning. In Calcutta session, one important qualification, however, the moderate leadership was able to introduce, that this enlarged meaning of the boycott would not be applicable for other provinces. So it was not a wholesale victory of the extremists in Calcutta. In 1907, they wanted to undo this. So the earlier plan was to hold the Congress session at Pune, which was, as you know, a stronghold of the militant nationalists. Tilak was very influential in Pune politics. So at the last moment, the moderate Bombay leaders shifted the venue from Pune to Surat, where the Congress met in 1907, and Lajpat Rai became the extremist candidate for the Congress president, which Lajpat Rai was not willing to contest. So Rajbihari Ghosh, a Bengal moderate, was the nominee for the Congress president. But as you know, the differences became so great that ultimately at Surat the Congress split. These extremists moved out of the Congress session and returned once again after a lapse of about 9 years. When we see all these things, we can actually measure the impact of the Swadeshi spirit on contemporary political life. And if we quickly actually try to wind up this discussion by making an assessment, we have already noted that the Swadeshi had its own limitations. But at the same time, we see how the Swadeshi Samitis were adopting new techniques of mass mobilization. Labor movement was one such technique. But you have other techniques as well, holding musical conferences, campaigning among the rural folks by holding theatre performances, local folk jatras through which the Swadeshi message was spread. So the Samitis certainly emerged as a critical linkage between the masses and the leadership, and some of these Samitis, as we have said, were devoted to the spread of the Swadeshi ideal through a variety of techniques of mobilization which they have adopted, all of which eventually suggest the first effort by the nationalists to undertake mass mobilization, although it didn't succeed in the way Aurobindo and others had visualized it. The armed revolution never happened at that stage, but it left behind many examples of bravery, heroism, self-sacrifice to inspire the later generations of freedom fighters as well. Lastly, the failure to create a mass base became compounded with a more dangerous trend in Indian politics with communalism. In the process of enforcing boycott of foreign goods on the rural population, on the peasantry, who naturally didn't like to buy high-priced local products, in the absence of local industries producing commodities in competitive prices, it was inevitable that the rural folks would buy cheaper goods. And when there were attempts to enforce boycott by forcing the rural people to buy high-priced local goods, it created rural tensions. And many of these peasants were Muslims. They became involved in riots. And these rioters were often described by the Swadesists as the agents of imperialism, which was a wrong assessment. But it actually sowed the seed of discord in Bengal countryside, about which Tagore was aware in the famous novel Ghore Baire, The Home and the World, in which this problem was touched on. So, despite the great achievements of the Swadeshi movement remained an example of an inadequate mass politics.